Today in this video we're going to talk about how we turn wordy problems into equations and then go on and solve them. So the first thing we need to understand is that we can only solve an equation in terms of one variable at this stage. So we need to make sure we define that variable. Anything that relies on that variable means that we're then able to convert that into anything to do with that one variable. So that's what we call the independent variable. And that's really important that it's defined. Then we need to go through and look for what operations are there in this sentence. So for example, if we see Hannah has 5 more than, we need to understand that more than represents the plus sign. If we're talking about the difference between something and something, we need to understand that that's going to represent the takeaway sign. If we talk about lots of, 5 lots of this, or times 3 times this, we're dealing with the multiplication sign. And if we're dealing with sharing, Joe shares with so-and-so, we're dealing with the divide sign. So it's really important to pinpoint those key operations before setting up your equation. So I'll write a problem up and we'll get started. So here's the problem. Joe scored 5 more points than Hannah. If they scored a total of 27 points, how many points did they each score? The third thing we need to do is look for that independent variable. Well, if I read this, Joe's score is dependent on what Hannah gets. So Hannah is the independent variable. So let's let H represent Hannah. You can let any letter represent, but let's let H equal the number of points that Hannah scores. Okay, now you can write that out. Oh, that's Hannah's points, okay? Now, more than is in there. So more than means plus. So let's set this first sentence up. Joe scored 5 more points than Hannah. So therefore, what Joe gets is 5 plus H. Now, if they scored a total of 27 points altogether, so that means Joe plus Hannah. Well, this is Joe's score, so we need to add Hannah's score to it and then have a total. The total usually is represented by the equal sign, 27. And what I've managed to do is transform this into an equation. Now I can follow through my rules and solve it. So first thing I spot is I can simplify the left-hand side. I've got 5 plus 2h equals 27. Go through, subtract 5 from each side. I'm left with 2h equals 22. And finally, dividing by 2 leaves me with h on its own. 22 divided by 2 is 11. Now I need to then rewrite this back into a sentence to make sure that it's comprehensible and it applies to the problem. So this means Hannah scored 11 points and therefore Joe scored 16 points because Joe had 5 more than Hannah. Okay? All right, so second problem here. Let's just have a read. We've got taxi charges of $3.60 plus $1.38 per kilometre. If Kate's fare was $38.10, how far did she travel? So we want to know how far she travelled. But the cost of the total taxi charge is dependent on how many kilometres she travels. So therefore, the number of kilometres is our independent variable and everything relies on that. So let's let x equal the number of kilometres travelled, okay? All right, now let's set it up. So let's work out what the cost of a regular taxi fare is. Taxi charges are $3.60, so 3.6, put a 0 on the end if you like, plus $1.38 per kilometre. So that means for every single kilometre. So we look at that and go, that's a multiply sign. So we've got plus $1.38 multiplied by x. And the total cost came to $38.10. So now we have our equation. We've got to go through and solve it. So I'm going to subtract $3.60 from $38.10. So do that from each side. It's $34.50. Then I'm going to need to use my calculator to divide $34.50 by $1.38 to solve for the number of kilometres travelled. So doing that actually comes out at 25. We need to translate that into the problem. Therefore, Kate travelled 25 kilometres.